20 years of marriage destroyed in one night. My wife spent months preparing for her high school reunion, like it was her wedding day. When she disappeared with her ex-boyfriend, I didn't chase after her like some pathetic fool. Instead, I did something that would haunt her forever. My name is Rupert Hicks. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent 15 years building Hicks Plumbing from nothing into the most reliable service company in our county. Started with just me and a beat-up truck. Now I've got 12 employees and a reputation that keeps the phone ringing. It's honest work that gets your hands dirty, but pays the bills and funds my daughter's college savings. Heather and I married young, right after high school. She was the prettiest girl in our graduating class, and somehow I convinced her to take a chance on a guy whose biggest ambition was fixing pipes. We were kids, but we made it work. Built a life together, bought a house, raised our daughter Imogen right. For nearly 2 decades, I thought we had something solid. The trouble started 3 months ago when Heather got that damn reunion invitation. 20-year high school reunion. You'd think she won the lottery the way she carried on about it. Suddenly, she was digging through old photo albums, talking about people I'd never heard her mention, spending hours on social media, reconnecting with classmates. At first, I figured it was harmless nostalgia. But then the obsession kicked in. Heather started talking about the reunion like it was the most important event of her life. She bought new clothes, started a diet, went to some fancy salon. When I asked why she was going to all this trouble, she laughed and said she wanted to look good for her old friends. Fair enough, I thought. The real wake-up call came when she started neglecting everything else. Our daughter Imogen noticed first. Mom was always on her phone, always distracted, always talking about high school like it was yesterday. Family dinners became silent affairs with Heather scrolling through Facebook, giggling at posts from people she claimed were just old friends. I'm not a jealous man by nature. 20 years of marriage teaches you to trust your partner. But when your wife starts acting like a teenager again, when she stops caring about the life you've built together, well, a man starts to wonder what's going on. The breaking point came 2 weeks before the reunion. I was working late when I came home around 10. Heather was on the phone in our bedroom, door closed, talking in hushed tones. When I walked in, she quickly ended the call and claimed it was her sister. But I knew my wife's voice when she talked to her sister, and this wasn't it. This was different, softer, more intimate. That's when I started paying real attention. That's when I realized our marriage was in serious trouble. The next few weeks were like watching my wife transform into someone I didn't recognize. Heather threw herself into preparing for this reunion like she was getting ready for her wedding day all over again. Every spare moment was spent shopping, planning, or talking about how excited she was to see everyone. The woman who used to complain about spending money on herself suddenly had no problem dropping serious cash on a complete makeover. "Rupert, I need your opinion," Heather said one Saturday morning, spinning around in our bedroom, wearing a dress I'd never seen before. "Does this make me look younger?" I looked up from the plumbing supply catalog I was reviewing. The dress was tight, way tighter than anything she'd worn in years, and definitely more expensive than our usual budget allowed. "You look great, honey. Where did you buy that?" "Yesterday," she said, checking herself out in the mirror from different angles. "I found it at that boutique downtown. It wasn't cheap, but I want to look perfect for the reunion." Perfect for the reunion. Not perfect for me. Not perfect for our family. Perfect for a bunch of people she hadn't seen in 20 years. I bit my tongue and went back to my catalog, but something about the way she was primping bothered me more than I cared to admit. The shopping didn't stop there. Heather made appointments at the spa, got her nails done professionally for the first time in years, and even went to some fancy hair salon in the city. When I saw the credit card bill, I nearly choked on my coffee. $300 for a haircut? I've been cutting my own hair for the past decade to save money for Imogen's college fund. Don't you think you're going a little overboard? I asked her one evening as she modeled yet another new outfit. It's just a high school reunion, not the Met Gala. Heather's face darkened. Just a reunion? Rupert, this is important to me. These people knew me when I was young, when I had dreams and ambitions. I want them to see that I've made something of myself. You have made something of yourself, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You're a wife, a mother, a partner in building this life we have. Isn't that enough? She turned away from me and went back to the mirror. You wouldn't understand. You never cared about high school or staying connected with people from the past. She was right about that. I've been too busy getting stuffed in lockers and having my lunch money stolen to form any lasting friendships. But watching her spend more energy on impressing people from 20 years ago than she'd spent on our relationship in months was starting to wear on me. The worst part was how it affected Imogen. Our 16-year-old daughter was going through her own teenage drama, dealing with college prep and boyfriend troubles, but Heather barely seemed to notice. When Imogen tried to talk to her mother about a problem at school, Heather would give distracted responses while scrolling through her phone, looking at photos from her high school days. "Dad, what's wrong with Mom?" Imogen asked me one night while Heather was out getting another beauty treatment. "She's acting weird." I didn't know how to answer that question without worrying my daughter unnecessarily. "She's just excited about seeing old friends, sweetheart. She'll be back to normal after the reunion." But deep down, I was starting to wonder if that was true. The night of the reunion finally arrived, and I watched my wife get ready like she was preparing for the most important night of her life. Heather spent 3 hours in front of the mirror, trying on different jewelry, adjusting her makeup, asking me the same questions over and over again. "Does this dress make me look fat?" she asked for the 5th time, turning sideways in front of her bedroom mirror. "You look beautiful, Heather," I said, and I meant it. She did look stunning, but not for me. She was getting dolled up for other people, people who hadn't been part of our lives for 20 years. "I'm so nervous," she said, applying another coat of lipstick. "What if nobody remembers me? What if I've changed too much?" I wanted to tell her that the people who matter were right here in this house, me and Imogen. Instead, I just straightened my tie and tried to be supportive. "They'll remember you. How could they forget?" The reunion was being held at the Marriott downtown, and I'd agreed to go as her date. Part of me hoped that being there together would remind her of what we had, that seeing me beside her would snap her out of whatever fantasy she was chasing. I was wrong. The moment we walked into that ballroom, I became invisible. Heather lit up like a Christmas tree, squealing and hugging people I'd never met, introducing me as an afterthought before diving into conversations about teachers and parties and drama from 2 decades ago. I stood there in my best suit, feeling like hired help at my own wife's party. "Oh my God, Heather Williams," a voice called out from across the room. I turned to see a tall, well-dressed man with silver hair making his way toward us. Heather's face went pale, then flushed bright red. "Angelo," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. So this was Angelo. I'd heard the name mentioned exactly once in 20 years of marriage, and now I was looking at the reason my wife had spent 3 months transforming herself. He was everything I wasn't: polished, confident, the kind of guy who probably never had dirt under his fingernails or calluses on his hands. "You look absolutely incredible," Angelo said, taking both of Heather's hands in his. "Time has been very kind to you." Heather giggled like a schoolgirl. Actually giggled. I hadn't heard that sound in years. "Angelo, this is my husband, Rupert." Angelo barely glanced at me before turning his attention back to Heather. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight. I've thought about you so many times over the years." Right there in front of me, like I didn't exist. This guy was laying it on thick, and my wife was eating it up. I cleared my throat and extended my hand. "Nice to meet you," I said, gripping his hand firmly enough to let him know I wasn't some pushover. Angelo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Likewise." Heather always had excellent taste. The conversation continued, but I might as well have been a piece of furniture. They talked about old times, old friends, old dreams. Everything old. Nothing about the life Heather had built since then. Nothing about our daughter, our home, our 20 years together. I excused myself to get a drink and watched from across the room as my wife reconnected with her past, completely forgetting about her present. I spent most of the reunion nursing whiskey at the bar, watching my wife laugh and dance with people who knew her when she was 18. Every time I tried to join a conversation, I felt like an outsider. These people shared memories I wasn't part of, experiences I'd never understand. But what really got to me was how much Heather seemed to prefer their company to mine. Around 10 o'clock, I realized I hadn't seen her in over an hour. I walked around the ballroom, checking every corner, every group of people. Heather was nowhere to be found. Neither was Angelo. I pulled out my phone and called her. It went straight to voicemail. I tried texting, "Where are you?" No response. A cold feeling settled in my stomach as I continued searching the hotel. The lobby, the restaurant, even a parking garage. Nothing. "Excuse me," I said to a woman wearing a name tag that identified her as Sarah Chun, class of 2004. "Have you seen my wife, Heather?" She was talking to Angelo Thornton earlier. Sarah's expression grew uncomfortable. "Oh, I think they left together. Something about going to the after-party at Mulligan's bar downtown." Left together. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. My wife had abandoned me at her reunion to go party with her high school boyfriend. I stood there in that hotel lobby, still wearing my best suit, feeling like the biggest fool in the world. I should have gone to Mulligan's. I should have burst through those doors and demanded to know what the hell was going on. But something inside me, pride, maybe, or just plain exhaustion, made me turn around and walk to my truck instead. The drive to Mulligan's took 15 minutes, but I sat in the parking lot for another 10, staring at the neon signs and listening to music thumping through the walls. Finally, I got out and walked inside. The place was packed with reunion goers, but it didn't take long to spot them. Heather and Angelo were on the dance floor, pressed close together like they were the only two people in the room. His hands were on her waist, her arms around his neck, and they were looking at each other like they were planning to pick up exactly where they'd left off 20 years ago. I watched my wife, the mother of my child, the woman I'd built a life with, move her body against another man like she'd never done with me. Not in years, anyway. The way she looked at him, smiled at him, touched him, it was like seeing a stranger wear my wife's face. Then Angelo leaned down and kissed her. Not a friendly peck, not a nostalgic moment between old friends. A real kiss, passionate and hungry, the kind of kiss that meant something. And Heather kissed him back with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from her in a decade. That's when I knew. This wasn't about nostalgia or old friendships. This was about my wife choosing someone else over the life we'd built together. This was about her deciding that 20 years of marriage meant less than one night with a ghost from her past. I turned around and walked out of that bar without saying a word. I didn't make a scene, didn't confront them, didn't give anyone a show. I just left, got in my truck, and drove home to start planning the rest of my life. A life that clearly wasn't going to include Heather. A real man doesn't beg for what should be freely given, and he sure as hell doesn't fight for someone who's already made their choice. The drive home felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. I didn't blast the radio or pound the steering like some broken-hearted fool in a country song. I just drove in silence, my mind crystal clear about what needed to happen next. Heather had made her choice back at that bar. Now I was going to make mine. When I pulled into our driveway, the house looked the same as always. Porch light on, Imogen's car in its usual spot, the life we'd built together sitting there like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The man who'd left for that reunion wasn't the same one coming home. I walked through her front door for what I knew would be the last time as Heather's husband. The place was quiet. Imogen was spending the night at her friend Sarah's house, probably assuming her parents would want privacy after their big night out. If she only knew. I didn't waste time on sentiment. I went straight to our bedroom and pulled my old military duffel bag from the back of the closet. 20 years in the same house, and it all came down to what I could fit in one bag. Clothes, toiletries, important documents, just the essentials. I wasn't taking anything that would remind me of the life I was leaving behind. My hands were steady as I packed. No shaking, no second-guessing. This wasn't anger or hurt pride talking. This was a man who'd seen the truth and was acting on it. Heather wanted her high school fantasy more than she wanted our marriage. Fine, she could have it. I moved through the house methodically, collecting the few things that mattered. My grandfather's watch from the nightstand, the photo of me and my father from my desk, my laptop and business files. I left behind the wedding photos, the vacation souvenirs, the shared memories that no longer meant what they used to. The hardest part was writing the note for Imogen. My daughter deserved an explanation. But how do you tell a 16-year-old that her mother had chosen to destroy their family for a dance with the past? I kept it simple. Had to leave town for business. We'll call you tomorrow. Love, Dad. Before I left, I did one last thing. I went to our home office and logged into our joint bank accounts. We'd built those savings together over 20 years, but I only took what was mine. Half of everything, split right down the middle. If Heather wanted to start over with Angelo, she could do it on her own dime. My wedding ring came off easily, maybe too easily. I set it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, where she'd be sure to see it. No dramatic note, no angry letter. Just a simple message. The man who'd loved her unconditionally for 20 years was done. I loaded my truck and drove away from the house without looking back. Heather would come home eventually, probably sometime before dawn, expecting to find her husband asleep and unaware of what had happened. Instead, she'd find an empty house and the consequences of her choices. By the time the sun came up, I was 3 states away, and Rupert Hicks, the husband, was nothing but a memory. Heather stumbled through the front door at 4:30 a.m., her makeup smeared and her carefully styled hair a mess. She was still wearing that expensive dress, but now it looked wrinkled and cheap. The alcohol in her system made everything fuzzy around the edges, but she was sober enough to know she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The house felt different somehow. Too quiet, too still. Usually when she came home late, she could sense Rupert's presence even when he was sleeping. Tonight, the silence felt absolute. "Rupert," she called softly, not wanting to wake him, but needing to know he was there. No answer. She kicked off her heels and padded upstairs to their bedroom, already rehearsing the story she'd tell him. She'd been talking to old friends, lost track of time, her phone had died. Simple explanations for a complicated betrayal. The bedroom was empty. The bed hadn't been slept in. Heather's alcohol-fogged brain struggled to process this information. Maybe he'd fallen asleep in his recliner watching TV. Maybe he'd gone out for an early morning jog. There had to be a logical explanation. But when she saw the closet, the truth hit her like a physical blow. Half of it was empty. Rupert's clothes, his shoes, his work uniforms, gone. She stumbled to the bathroom. His toothbrush, razor, cologne, all missing. "No, no, no," she whispered, rushing downstairs with growing panic. His truck keys weren't hanging on their usual hook. His coffee mug wasn't in the sink. It was like he'd never lived there at all. The note on the counter made her knees buckle. Not the passionate love letter she'd been expecting, not even an angry accusation. Just a simple goodbye that cut deeper than any screaming match could have. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers and called him. Straight to a recording. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." He disconnected his phone, changed his number, cut off all communication. The bank account notification on her laptop confirmed her worst fears. Rupert had withdrawn exactly half of their savings. His half. He wasn't coming back angry or hurt or ready to fight for their marriage. He was just gone, as completely as if he'd never existed. Heather sank onto the kitchen floor, still wearing her reunion dress, and finally understood what she'd lost. Not just a husband, but a partner, a father to her daughter, a man who'd loved her unconditionally for 20 years. She'd traded all of that for a few hours of feeling young again, for the fantasy of what might have been with Angelo. The worst part was knowing that Rupert had probably seen everything. He'd witnessed her betrayal and chosen not to fight for her, not to make a scene, not to give her the dramatic confrontation that might have cleared the air. Instead, he'd simply written her off and moved on, like she was no longer worth the effort. When Imogen came home that afternoon and asked where her father was, Heather had no answer. How do you tell your daughter that you destroyed your family for one night of reliving high school glory? How do you explain that the man who'd raised her with love and dedication was gone because his wife had decided their life together wasn't enough? The empty house echoed with 20 years of memories, but all Heather could think about was the look in Angelo's eyes when she told him she was married. He'd smiled and said it didn't matter, that some connections were worth the risk. Now she was sitting alone in the wreckage of her marriage, and Angelo was probably back in his hotel room, already forgetting her name. 3 days passed before Heather finally understood the full scope of what had happened. She'd spent those days calling Rupert's disconnected number, driving to places they used to go together, even showing up at his business only to find out he'd sold it to his foreman for a fraction of what it was worth. He said he needed cash fast. Mike Torres, his former employee, told her. Signed everything over and left town the same day. Didn't say where he was going. When Heather finally worked up the courage to check their bank accounts, the reality hit her like a freight train. Their joint savings account was cleared. Their checking account was emptied. Even their emergency fund was gone. Rupert had taken exactly half of everything, down to the penny, leaving her with enough to survive, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle they'd built together. Her phone had been disconnected too. Apparently, he'd been paying for their family plan. The credit cards were canceled. The life insurance policies were cashed out. It was like watching 20 years of shared financial history disappear overnight. "Mom, what's happening?" Imogen asked, finding her mother staring at the computer screen in shock. "Dad's been gone for 3 days, and you won't tell me anything." Heather looked at her 16-year-old daughter and tried to find words that wouldn't destroy the girl's image of her father. "We had some problems, sweetheart. He needed space to think things through." "This isn't taking space," Imogen said, her voice rising. "This is him leaving us." "What did you do?" The accusation in her daughter's voice cut deep, mostly because it was accurate. "I made a mistake," Heather admitted. "A big mistake." "What kind of mistake makes Dad disappear completely?" Heather couldn't answer that question without admitting the truth about Angelo, about the reunion, about choosing one night of fantasy over 20 years of reality. Instead, she just sat there as her daughter stormed out of the room, leaving her alone with the consequences of her choices. The house felt enormous and empty now. Every room echoed with memories of the family that used to live there. Imogen barely spoke to her, spending most of her time at friends' houses or locked in her room. The bills kept coming, but without Rupert's income from the plumbing business, Heather had no idea how she was going to pay them. She tried calling Angelo, hoping he might have some advice or at least a sympathetic ear. His number went straight to voicemail, and he never called back. Whatever connection they'd felt at the reunion had evaporated the moment real life intruded on their fantasy. By the end of the week, Heather realized she was completely alone. Her husband was gone, her daughter blamed her, and the man she'd thrown her marriage away for had already forgotten she existed. The reunion dress still hung in her closet, an expensive reminder of the most costly mistake of her life. Weeks turned into months, and still no word from Rupert. Heather hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Jerry Sullivan, who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. "Your husband's good at disappearing," Sullivan told her during their third meeting. "He's not using credit cards, not leaving a paper trail. It's like he planned this whole thing in advance." "He couldn't have planned it," Heather protested. "This all happened because of one night. One stupid mistake." Sullivan gave her a look that suggested he'd heard that story before. "Lady, people don't just vanish overnight unless they've been thinking about it for a while. Your husband was ready to go. Question is, what made him ready?" Heather couldn't answer that without admitting what she'd done at the reunion. The guilt was eating her alive, but she couldn't bring herself to confess the full truth to anyone, not even the investigator she was paying to find her missing husband. The search led them through 3 states. Rupert had been spotted at a truck stop in Tennessee, then at a diner in Arkansas. Always alone, always paying cash, always moving. He was staying one step ahead of anyone trying to track him down. "He's got help," Sullivan concluded after a month of dead ends. "Someone's giving him advice on how to stay hidden. This is an amateur hour." Meanwhile, life at home continued to fall apart. Imogen had started acting out at school, her grades slipping as she dealt with her father's abandonment. The bills were piling up faster than Heather could pay them. She'd taken a job at a local real estate office, but the commission-based income was nowhere near enough to maintain their previous lifestyle. "Maybe we should just move," Imogen said one night at dinner. "Get a smaller place. Start over somewhere else." "We're not moving," Heather said firmly. "This is our home. Your father will come back, and when he does, I want him to find us here." "He's not coming back, Mom," Imogen said quietly. "And honestly, I don't blame him." The words stung because they rang true. Heather had destroyed her family for one night of feeling young again, and now she was left with nothing but regret and a house she couldn't afford. Every day that passed without word from Rupert made it clearer that her marriage was truly over. But she couldn't give up. She had to find him, had to explain, had to somehow make him understand that Angelo meant nothing and their life together meant everything. She had to believe that 20 years of marriage was worth more than one night of betrayal, even if Rupert had already proven that it wasn't. 7 months after Rupert disappeared, Jerry Sullivan finally tracked him down to a small town in Colorado. He was working a local hardware store, renting a modest apartment, living quietly under his real name. The man who'd built a successful plumbing business from nothing had started over as a retail clerk, and according to Sullivan, he seemed content with his simple new life. "He's not hiding anymore," Sullivan reported. "It's like he's moved on completely." Heather didn't hesitate. She drove 14 hours straight to Colorado, rehearsing what she'd say during every mile. She'd apologize, explain that Angelo meant nothing, beg him to come home for Imogen's sake. She'd do whatever it took to fix what she'd broken. She found him leaving the hardware store at closing time, looking older but somehow more at peace than she remembered. When he saw her, his expression didn't change. No anger, no surprise, just the calm acknowledgement of an inevitable meeting. "Hello, Heather," Rupert said, stopping beside his used pickup truck. "Rupert, please, we need to talk," she said, the words tumbling out faster than she'd planned. "I made a terrible mistake. Angelo was nothing, just a stupid fantasy. You're my husband, my partner. We can fix this." Rupert pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "Divorce papers. Already filed. You should have received your copy by now." "I threw them away," she said desperately. "I won't sign them. We have 20 years together. We have Imogen. That has to count for something." 20 years did count for something, Rupert said quietly. "Until you decided it didn't. It was one night, one stupid mistake," Heather pleaded. "People make mistakes. Marriages survive worse than this." "Do they?" Rupert asked. "Because I watched my wife choose another man over our life together. I watched her walk away from our anniversary, our daughter, our home, all for a dance with someone who forgot her name the next morning." The words cut deep because they were true. Angelo had never called, never reached out, never acknowledged what had happened between them. "I was going through something," Heather said. "A midlife crisis. Maybe. I felt old and invisible, and when I saw Angelo, I remembered what it felt like to be young and desired." "It didn't mean anything." "It meant everything," Rupert replied. "It meant that after 20 years of marriage, you still thought there was something better out there. It meant that the life we built together wasn't enough to keep you from looking backward." Heather reached for his arm, but he stepped away. "Please, Rupert. I know I hurt you, but we can rebuild. We can be stronger than before." "No, we can't," he said with the finality of a man who'd already grieved his marriage. "You made your choice that night. Now I'm making mine." He got in his truck and drove away, leaving her standing in an empty parking lot with divorce papers in her hand, and the crushing realization that some mistakes can't be undone. 2 years later, Rupert Hicks owned his own small hardware store in Colorado and had built a quiet, peaceful life far from the wreckage of his marriage. He'd kept his word about supporting Imogen through college, sending money every month and talking to her regularly. His daughter had chosen to stay with him during summer breaks, preferring his stable presence to her mother's guilt-ridden attempts at rebuilding their relationship. "I'm proud of how you handled everything, Dad," Imogen told him during one of their fishing trips. "You could have made things ugly, could have tried to turn me against Mom, but you didn't. Your mother made her own choices," Rupert said. "She has to live with the consequences, but that doesn't mean you should suffer for them." Heather had eventually been forced to sell the house and move into a smaller apartment. The real estate job barely covered her expenses, and without Rupert's income, the lifestyle they'd built together was unsustainable. She dated a few men over the past 2 years, but none of them measured up to the husband she'd thrown away for one night of nostalgia. Angelo had never contacted her again. According to mutual friends, he'd returned to his life in Chicago as if the reunion had never happened. For him, it had been just another evening of entertainment. For Heather, it had cost her everything that mattered. The divorce had been finalized without drama. Rupert had been fair in the settlement, ensuring that Heather received enough to start over, while keeping enough for himself to build his new life. He'd handled it with the same quiet dignity that had characterized their entire marriage, the dignity she'd failed to appreciate until it was gone. On quiet evenings in his apartment above the hardware store, Rupert sometimes wondered if things could have been different. If he'd paid more attention to Heather's restlessness, if he'd fought harder for their marriage, if he'd been the kind of husband who could compete with 20-year-old fantasies. But those thoughts never lasted long. A man can only be responsible for his own choices, and he'd chosen to walk away from someone who didn't value what they had together. Imogen was thriving in college, majoring in engineering and planning a career that would let her build things that lasted, a trait she'd inherited from her father. She visited Heather occasionally, but their relationship remained strained. Some trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. Rupert had learned that starting over at 43 wasn't the end of the world. He'd built one successful life from nothing. He could build another. The difference was that this time, he was building it for himself, not for someone who might decide it wasn't enough. He never remarried, never felt the need to. He'd given his whole heart to one woman for 20 years, and when she'd thrown it away, he decided that was enough. Some men are meant for multiple loves. Others have just one great love in them. Rupert had used his up on a woman who'd preferred the past to the present, and he was at peace with that choice. The hardware store thrived. Imogen graduated with honors, and life went on. Different than planned, but good in its own way. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well.